Hello and welcome to Politics Theory Other. My name is Alex Doherty and my guest today is Eleanor Janega. In today's episode we talked about the Christian right and the role of Christian Zionist ideology in the minds of key figures in the Trump administration and the decision to launch the US and Israeli attack on Iran. We chatted about why the religious beliefs of US policymakers are often under-discussed, whether it's conceivable that Donald Trump is undergoing some sort of religious turn under the influence of the various religious fanatics around him, and we talked about the different religious strains of Christian right thinking that exist within the administration, from Calvinists to Catholic Integralists. And we also talked about Christian Zionism and how attitudes towards Israel and the role designated to Jewish people in the apocalyptic scenarios of the Christian right have changed over time. And finally, we touched on the extraordinary spat between the administration and the Vatican and Pope Leo. If you find this interview useful, then please do consider becoming a £5 patron of the podcast. The show depends entirely upon listener support, and as well as keeping PTO going, you'll also get access to bonus content. You can support the show in pounds or whatever your local currency happens to be, and you can pledge any amount you choose. Go to patreon.com/polltheoryother to sign up. Before we get to today's interview, just a quick word on our friends over at The Breakdown, who have just dropped the third issue of their magazine, titled Airborne. The engines of industrial production that power the modern economy release vast quantities of carbon and pollutants into the air, seeping into our soil, our water, and even our bodies. Air pollution alone is responsible for around 10 million deaths each year, and yet this everyday emergency has not fundamentally reshaped how we understand our place in the world. The new issue of The Breakdown explores the tensions between global causes and local effects, between the invisible and the immediate. It looks to the air itself, the medium that surrounds us, connects us, and sustains life, even as it becomes increasingly contested and compromised. To celebrate the launch of the new issue, Planet B and The Breakdown are hosting a live podcast and party on May 6th at the Art House in Bethnal Green. The discussion will be hosted by Adrienne Buller, featuring political economists Daniela Gabor, Jeff Mann and Oliver Eagleton. You can find a link to both the new issue and the event in the show notes. And now to today's interview. Eleanor Janega is a medieval historian and the creator of the popular blog Going Medieval. She's the co-host of the podcasts Gone Medieval and We're Not So Different, which examines the political aspects of medieval history. She's the author of The Once and Future Sex, Going Medieval on Women's Roles in Society, and The Middle Ages, A Graphic History. So Eleanor, when people discuss why the Trump administration took the decision to launch its attack on Iran, in concert, of course, with Israel, the main factors that tend to be touched upon include things like the preservation of US and Israeli hegemony in the Middle East and the administration's desire to destroy all remaining adversaries and adversaries who were, in the case of Iran and Hezbollah, perceived to be at a moment of historic weakness. Then there's Israel's role in potentially tipping the scales by selling war with Iran to Trump as some kind of quick and relatively painless win. And then there's, of course, the extent to which the US attack on Venezuela fed into the apparent mood of omnipotence and hubris in the White House. But perhaps a less discussed factor is the extent to which the Trump administration is populated with figures who are closely identified with the various branches of the Christian right, most obviously Pete Hegseth at the Department of Defense, and that their religious convictions may have played a role in the decision. So on March 6th, in the early phases of the war, 30 US House Democrats wrote this letter demanding an internal Defense Department investigation into growing discourse within the US military that was framing the Iran war in the context of biblical end times. In that letter, sent to the US Defense Department's Inspector General, the signatories argued that Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth and other senior US officials had, quote, publicly framed Middle East policy in explicitly religious terms. We also know, of course, that one US military commander reportedly told his troops that the Iran war was part of God's divine plan and that Donald Trump has been, quote, anointed by Jesus to fight the war in order to cause Armageddon. And now that's, Armageddon in the biblical sense, referring to the ancient city of Megiddo in present-day northern Israel. where, according to Revelations, a final battle between good and evil is supposed to take place. Then we had Senator Lindsey Graham, who reportedly played an important role in convincing Trump to attack Iran. For his part, he called the conflict a religious war. So given the extreme recklessness, aside from the criminality, the recklessness of launching an attack on Iran and the extraordinary scale of the violence that figures like Trump and Hegseth have openly reveled in, and given the remarkable absence of serious planning, the behavior perhaps of people who don't think it's important to properly get your ducks in a row, have God on your side. So do you think it's possible that the religious fanaticism of members of the administration and their apparently genuine belief that they are fighting a religious war akin to the medieval Crusades may have played a significant part in the final decision to launch the attack?
Almost undoubtedly. And I think to argue otherwise is to be willfully ignorant to an extent. And I can understand why this is an aspect that is often overlooked because it's quite uncomfortable. And also, fundamentally, if one hasn't dedicated their life to learning about eschatological thought, as I have, these are things that can kind of slip under the radar for people. And it is incumbent upon us, I think, even though we often try to, as intellectuals, sort of downplay ideas of religiosity because they are uncomfortable. And indeed, here we are in the 21st century, and we would like to believe that they aren't that involved in politics. But there is not a small subsection of American society that really does seem to look at things within a religious context. And, you've mentioned Armageddon here. I think an important thing to keep in mind about Christianity, which a lot of people sort of disavow when they think about it now, is that it is fundamentally a linear religion. There is a beginning, there is a middle, there is an end. The beginning, in theory, is the creation of the world in the Garden of Eden. The middle is sort of when Jesus arrives, and the end, it's very expressly stated by Jesus in something we call the little apocalypse, which comes up in the Gospels. He says the world is going to end. You're never going to know when it is. And that is just something that we're looking toward. And then, of course, that's what the book of Revelation covers, is what's going to happen at the end of the world. And it is an ongoing facet of Christianity where some people are really saying that the apocalypse is going to happen at any moment, the world will end. And ordinarily, we do see historically religious advisors try to sort of pull that back and rein it in. And that is one of the issues with modern Christianity and the fact that we don't have religious leaders in the same way for many of the American sorts of Protestantism, is that there's no one to sort of put a lid on this. And so there's this idea of a very independent relationship with God. You have preachers and those sorts of things who run churches, absolutely, but there's no one to tell Pete Hegseth to calm down, fundamentally. And indeed, Pete Hegseth has form for this. In 2020, he published a book that is titled American Crusade, Our Fight to Stay Free. And in the book, he expressly argues that America needs to pursue a crusade strategy, which he defines as being against leftists and Islam writ large. And certainly we do see that mentality playing out now.
And just going back to that point you make about the sort of linear character of Christianity and Christian thought. So it would be your view then that gives Christianity a certain radical potential that doesn't exist so much in some other religions?
Yeah, absolutely. And to an extent, what it's supposed to be doing, really, is curbing our worst excesses as humans. The idea that the world could end at any moment it's supposed to be essentially a memento mori, right? The world is going to end sometime at some point. Yeah. You ought not to be a bad person,
you better
right?
Behave yourself now. Yeah.
Exactly. And, it's quite interesting because within a context of, say, for example, the Roman Empire, or indeed within medieval Europe, this was something that was used by the church to try to get rulers to not engage in war quite often. Because war was very often seen as being a bad thing, because of all of the death, etc. Now, of course, if there are things like the Crusades, which are posited as holy wars, that's a totally different thing. But it is, in theory, meant to be a restraining idea, this end of the world. Everything shall pass. So if you are really focused on, for example, material gain, worldly power, these are things that will go away with the rest of the world. And then, in theory, you will then be able to, after the final judgment, join God in heaven. There have been more recently some new ideas, especially out of the American Christian movement regarding this. So in America, there is this thing that was called the Great Revival in the early 20th century, which is where we see kind of like the birthing of a lot of the American strands of Protestantism. And along with this, you do have a new idea, which I'm sure you've probably heard of in passing, called the rapture. And so the rapture is particularly interesting and rather frustrating because part of what is said repeatedly in the little apocalypse, or indeed even in Revelation, is that you don't get out of the end of the world, right? If you're alive during it, it's going to be really awful. And part of what is going to happen is you're very likely going to be killed. There's going to be wars. There will be monsters. The sea is going to become blood and then light on fire. The stars are going to fall from the sky. There's going to be immense suffering. However, if you're one of the faithful and you live through this particularly trying time, then you get to go to heaven. And if you die during the particularly trying time, it's also sort of like a balance in your favor. God will say, oh, yes, that was really tough that you had to put up with that. And so it's good on your balance sheet for the last judgment. But what the rapture posits is that you don't actually have to put up with that, and you're just going to be taken directly into heaven bodily.
And you become a spectator to the drama below.
Exactly. And so suddenly that opens up the possibility of being quite pro-Armageddon. And that's incredibly dangerous. And so we can say what we will about the medieval church as not necessarily the most moral arbiters in the entire world, but they would be horrified by this, right? Because the entire idea here is supposed to be that there's no way to get around these excesses. And in true American style, what we have here is a chance to say that, oh, the bad things will only happen to your enemies and it won't happen to you.
Just going back to the point you make about the seeming resistance to thinking about the importance of religion and Christianity to US policy. So in an article that appeared in Middle East Eye by Mohammed Al-Masri, there's a passage which I will read out, which I think is very relevant to this. He says that, imagine the reaction if two Muslim states launched a joint military operation on a non-Muslim society, with political leaders invoking Islamic scripture as justification for the war. And that operation struck 13 health facilities and 5 schools and killed 150 schoolgirls in the first week. The global reaction would be swift and unambiguous. Analysts would have decades of scholarship to draw upon when examining the role of religious motivations. But when American and Israeli leaders invoke biblical narratives while waging war, the religious dimension is only an afterthought in mainstream Western analysis and media. And reading that, one thing I was struck by, apart from the fact that it's clearly very true and the counterfactual is very powerful, I was also struck by the thought that that's perhaps not merely true of mainstream analysis, but also to an extent of left analysis as well, that in spite of the very overt religiosity of both the United States and Israel and the political leaderships in both countries, we perhaps don't talk enough about religious motivation in policy decisions. I just wonder if you could say a bit more about what you think that reticence on the left is about. Is it partly that we just, many people on the left, particularly in Europe, perhaps have little grounding in theology? Is it to do with the fact that we sort of pride ourselves on having a sort of properly materialist analysis, and that sometimes that can lead into a certain sort of economism that can't really grapple with matters such as religion?
Well, I think it's a little bit of both, to be honest. It's easier, obviously. I grew up in the States. I left when I was 21, but I was sort of steeped in it as one is. I went to Catholic schools. You do see quite a lot of it, so for example, at my high school, which was Catholic, it sort of was a feeder for any other Christian schools around us, so I had in my classmates, for example, who did not believe that the dinosaurs had existed and that the devil had put those bones into the ground to test your faith.
Testers, yeah.
Yeah. And so it's for us, I think, especially people who are working in an academic scope and these fields, part of the reticence, I think, of getting into it is fairly laughable. I'm sorry, it's funny. It is very funny that you think that the world was literally created in 7 days. Not even medieval Christians actually believed that. They would be very clear on the idea that it was a metaphor. So there is an inherent willful ignorance that is part and parcel of these American forms of Christianity and devotion. And I think that there is a tendency to treat that with an idea that it is therefore unserious. But I would argue that it's more dangerous, actually, as a result. And so also, obviously, from Europe, we just don't have to deal with it. It's quite interesting because since I've immigrated here, I'm not around it as much as I am anymore. And then I'll speak to my friends in the States and, they'll complain about these problems they have with Christians in their area and how politics goes down. And that's not something I ever have to really deal with any longer. So it is a kind of differentiation in terms of lived experience. But also, yes, in terms of education, you have to go out of your way to learn about these things. It is fairly in-depth reading. You do have to sit down and read the Bible, which isn't many people's idea of fun. I like the monster bits, is what I always say. So, that's how you end up being an apocalypse scholar, right? Because Revelation is great. The Danieline prophecies are great. It's all very fun. But it is, I think, interesting because, I do think that we do tend to take this materialist view of that's the most important thing. But I would say, as a materialist myself, these American ideas of Christianity are rooted in a materialist analysis of the world in the other direction, yes, your life might be difficult now, but you will get these rewards as a payoff. There is a very strong idea in terms of the Christian nationalist ideas within America that America is this moral arbiter, this Christian juggernaut that is there to lead the rest of the world. And that helps people overlook their material conditions, which are a lot of the material conditions in America are actually quite shocking. But you can kind of overcome that by telling these very powerful stories. So I do understand why people aren't really aware of these things because it does require specialist knowledge and it does require, a bit of work on something that you don't necessarily agree with. But unfortunately, I'm one of those sorts of people who, if I don't agree with something, I'll learn everything about it in order to argue with it. And then that's kind of how you get where I am. I think that we ignore it to our detriment. I mean, also, I suppose it's interesting within the Trump administration because actually I would argue Trump is one of our least Christian presidents in quite some time. This man is not religious at all, but he's surrounded by people who are. And that's a difference. But we certainly see, this kind of rhetoric, these ideas about America's involvement in the Middle East, going back to, at the very least, Reagan talked about it pretty expressly and openly. It was certainly a facet of George W. Bush's administration as well. So it is something that is an undercurrent that runs through it. And it is also a big part of America's support for Israel as well. There are obviously the geopolitical advantages to having kind of a Western outpost in the Middle East, but there are expressly apocalyptic ideas surrounding why Americans might wish to support the state of Israel.
Just going back to your comments on Donald Trump and him being actually an unusually irreligious figure when it comes to recent American presidents. Do you think that nonetheless there is some possibility that in spite of his cynicism, one can imagine that he takes a very sort of cynical instrumentalist approach to the Christian right, that he views them as a sort of, a core part of his coalition. He appreciates their support and their flattery. He's happy to accede to some of their demands, such as rolling back Roe versus Wade or recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital, but that he doesn't fundamentally share their priorities and their fanaticism. But I wonder if there is some possibility of a religious turn of sorts that could be sort of going on now. As I say, he's sort of subject to constant flattery from people like Lindsey Graham and Pete Hegseth, who basically tell him that he's an instrument of God's will. And one of the things we know about Trump is that he is a sucker for flattery. And if the flattery is more forthcoming, the more he professes to be motivated by these religious values, then, yeah, I wonder if some sort of radicalizing process occurs in which he actually comes to believe some of this stuff. And his sharing of that recent AI image of himself on Truth Social that, depicted him as this Christ-like figure healing a sick man is at least suggestive in that regard.
So I think you're bang on here. Because certainly we have seen him say certain things recently, where he said the other day that it's not looking good for him in terms of getting into heaven. Which is, which, yeah, like, yeah, I mean, like, I was like, wow, heartbreaking. The worst person has made a good point. So I do think that is actually particularly worrisome, because I don't think that he is going to say, oh, now I need to dedicate my life to charity and give all my money away, especially when he's surrounded by people, like Hegseth et al. So there are two things going on there. Yes, he's incredibly susceptible to flattery. So, yeah, if you begin to think about yourself as an instrument of God's will, while you are also simultaneously approaching the end of your life, that's quite potent. And certainly he would hardly be the first person who at the end of their life suddenly got all religious, right? There are many such cases, and we see this repeatedly. And, for example,
fortunately, those people don't have nuclear codes, but
yeah. It's like when it's Henry VIII, it's kind of charming almost, but with Trump, a little less so. But it was really interesting, that AI image that he shared. I and every other eschatologist was losing their minds, actually, about it. Because sharing an image of yourself as Christ, this shows where he kind of falls down, because he doesn't really have an actual Christian background. So that is what we would call antichrist behavior. So, part and parcel, again, with apocalyptic thought, the Antichrist is a large figure in the apocalypse, and there is this idea that before the actual apocalypse, Antichrist is going to come into the world. He's going to put himself forward as the return of Christ, which is supposed to be something that's going to happen. He is going to get the powerful of the world to worship him, and he is going to be successful in persuading a lot of Christians to follow him as well. He is then going to return to Jerusalem. He's going to rebuild the temple. The Jewish people will then convert and believe that he is the Messiah, at which point in time, the prophets Enoch and Elias will come back and start a fight with him. He kills them, and then he's going to attempt to ascend bodily into heaven on the Mount of Olives, at which point in time, he'll be struck down by the power of Christ's mouth. What that means is up for interpretation. And then after that happens, that's going to trigger the end of the world. So you could see why sharing pictures of yourself as Jesus is incredibly worrisome. And indeed, to their credit, a lot of American Christians were not happy about that.
He got a lot of pushback from it. And hastily deleted the image itself. Yeah.
But it does kind of show us where we are with him, because I do think that he is willing to sort of do things that he sees as being religious, but that is a really basic tenet of Christianity, and he should know that, and he would if he had any kind of background in Christianity. But instead he's just surrounded by sycophants who tell him that he is the spirit of Christ's mouth, I suppose. So which is troubling and keeps me up at night.
Although the administration is full of members of the Christian right, they obviously belong to lots of different tendencies. So there's the sort of the premillennial dispensationalists, like US Ambassador to Israel Mike Huckabee, Pete Hegseth, who represents this sort of Calvinist post-millennialist tradition, and perhaps you might, inform us a bit more about what these terms mean. And then there's the charismatic evangelism of Paula White-Cain, spiritual advisor to the White House. And lastly, the so-called Catholic Integralists, who want to integrate church and state. Could you say a bit about the various strands of the Christian right that are represented within the administration, and your sense of how they work together, where they disagree, and which tendency, if any, is more dominant?
This is quite a good question, Alex. So I suppose starting off with Hegseth, just because he's quite fresh in my mind. So he is of this Calvinist strain. Now, Calvinism, one of the worst forms of Christianity. That's a historical analysis right there. But with
Apologies for any of our Calvinist listeners.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I'm sure.
Many, but,
huge number.
Huge PTO demographic.
Yeah, absolutely. In particular, sees the struggle in terms of Christianity as being personal and being tied very expressly with a personal relationship with God that is also mediated through work and suffering to an extent. So this is a very common form of Christianity within very early capitalist thinking, for example. So Calvinist ideas that one ought to suffer, that there is a certain number of elect who will rise to the top of society as a result of this hard work, as a result of their own spirituality, really permeates a lot of especially early modern forms of Christianity. There's an argument that one could make that, for example, the Puritans are a bit of an offshoot of Calvinism. But essentially here, what it does is it gives you a way very conveniently to not care about, for example, the poor. Because it creates a way of saying, well, you are simply not working hard enough, and God blesses those who, God helps those who help themselves. Yeah, that's a very Calvinist attitude. And what Hegseth is expressing with his own ideas is that we also then need to move that forward into not just this idea of work, not just this idea of laboring in a work sense or in a capitalist sense, but also in terms of a martial sense. So one can undertake righteous war as a form of work, and that there are enemies of the Christian people who need to be confronted as a result.
And do you think that goes as far as Hegseth may genuinely believe it's his mission to, it's sort of extraordinary even to be uttering the words in a way, but that he genuinely believes it's his job to re-establish Christendom in the Middle East, proper sort of crusader ideas?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And he's written about this very expressly. He's got a kind of two-phase plan. So in the first place, there needs to be a sort of holy war within America to shed it of the problems of leftism. Leftism, which is defined by feminism or globalism or Marxism and progressivism. And so he thinks that these tendencies need to be purged within America, and then, or indeed as a part of the generalized crusade, we then need to go to war with Islam writ large in the Middle East. And very particularly, though, he does think that we need to be expressly at war with the Middle East. But it's quite interesting because he sees Iran as the best target. I do believe that to him, this is a result of the political tendencies within Israel. I'm sure that the close relationship between, for example, the Saudi royal family in America is in there. But interestingly, number two is actually Turkey. He's got a lot of problems with Turkey.
Not happy that they're in NATO for one day.
Exactly, and he expressly kind of calls them out as Ottomans, which was interesting. And he believes that Erdogan wants to restore the Ottoman Empire. So, he's got these kind of hand-picked ideas of who should be confronted in the Middle East, which is quite interesting if what we're also doing is we're looking at this as a crusade, because quite famously, the first crusade was about retaking Jerusalem. But, we do have fundamentally a Jerusalem that is in the hands of our political allies. And he seems quite happy with that. So he's not calling actually for a crusade, because a crusade was to say, let's have the Holy Land in Christian hands. But he is calling for a crusade, which he sees as a religious war against these particular targets. And I do think that is quite interesting, as you say, there's no clear exit strategy for what's happening with Iran, nor was there one in any of the Crusades, to
Yeah.
be fair, because they didn't want to exit. They wanted to kind of control these areas instead. So to be fair, that is apt, but it is strange to me to see the word crusade bandied about, in particular with reference to Iran. It isn't to say that there haven't been crusades against any number of targets, in Egypt, quite famously on the Third Crusade, because crusaders were attempting to stop where all of the money was coming from, essentially. But that went very badly. But it is strange to kind of see something that isn't in the Levant, or that isn't in the Nearer East, be targeted or discussed as a part of a meaningful crusade.
Yeah, I have a question which relates to that, and why there's no indication that Hegseth or people like him have any problem with Israeli control of Jerusalem, which they would see obviously as sort of Jewish control. But perhaps we might come back to that later. I mean, just go back to the point you make about Hegseth and his hostility to enemies, both abroad and internally. I mean, it makes me think of discussion around ICE and this notion of sort of imperial boomerang and the use of martial tactics being used domestically. And I read an interesting article that I shared with you by Robert D. Cruz, where he wrote at length on this theme and about how Hegseth has talked about his time in the city of Samarra in Iraq during the Iraq War, where he boasts of having killed many insurgents. And Cruz describes how Hegseth has talked of the American left being responsible for creating many little Samarras at home in the center of cities like Portland, Chicago, Minneapolis, various sort of liberally coded American cities. And the implications of that for how the left in those cities ought to be treated is, very chilling, of course.
I think that it is important to point out this is not being related to as a form of governing that is going to, in theory, create a peacetime situation, right? The interesting thing about ICE is that it isn't really, a policing mission in the way that we are traditionally asked to think about policing. It is not a protect and serve sort of ideal. It is very expressly about removing people who are seen as undesirable from American life. And, whether that be people who have irregular immigration status, or whether that just be somebody who is walking down the street and there is no real way of knowing. And it is interesting to me, I think, as a now outside observer, what cities he sort of picks and chooses. I know that Sarah Jaffe discussed this with you a few months ago. There's a reason why Minneapolis is on that list. It's a real hotbed of organization. Chicago has an almost mythic status with right-wing people in America as uniquely violent. And Portland, as a Pacific Northwesterner myself, I'm not quite sure exactly why Portland. I'm from the Seattle area, and I'm kind of like, hey, why not us? Like we're just as lefty as they are. But what is true about Portland is it is directly across the river from a fairly conservative city in Washington State, which is Vancouver, Washington. So it is often bandied about as a kind of front line, where you have sort of like the good, righteous, right-wing people of Vancouver, Washington, and then you have the horrible blue-haired lefties of Portland across the river. And although Vancouver is in Washington, Seattle is much further away from them than Portland. And I do also think that it is true that in places that are traditionally kind of bastions of leftism, like, for example, San Francisco or Seattle, there's less of a desire to send ICE in because I think that it would be a problem for capital. So they are picking and choosing targets that they see as soft, and it is expressly religious and about this idea of purifying America and getting rid of these unwanted elements.
Hegseth famously doesn't limit expressing his Christian right views to speeches and interviews. His body is also adorned with tattoos that carry political and religious significance. Those include, but are not limited to, the Jerusalem cross, also known as the Crusader cross, which he has emblazoned across his chest. He also has the Chi Rho, the first two letters of the Greek word for Christ. And then, and perhaps most contentiously, he has Deus Vult written on his bicep, which means God wills it. believed to be a Crusader battle cry. He also has another cross with a sword, referencing a verse in the Gospel of Matthew, reporting the supposed words of Jesus. Do not suppose that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. Could you talk a bit about the significance and history of the symbols used in those tattoos and what Hegseth is seeking to communicate with them?
So I find these to be incredibly important. And again, this is one of those things where if you don't have a significant background in religion, these things might pass you by. So in particular, as you say, Deus Vult is in theory a cry that everyone was so inspired by the declaration of the First Crusade that they were shouting out Deus Vult, God wills it, God wills it. Did that actually happen? We do not know, because really all the accounts of that meeting were written down 30 years later. It was turned into rather a lovely piece of propaganda. So whether or not that happened is debatable. But certainly it does become an idea further down the line and in successive crusades as well. The Jerusalem cross is quite an interesting one because it doesn't have a connection as a tattoo to initial crusaders, because Europeans were rather down on tattoos in the medieval period. We have a huge gap there. But there are very old and long-standing tattoo studios in Jerusalem that will give you these little tattoos. And they were often used by people in the modern period or early modern period who had visited the Holy Land, and it was supposed to be kind of a mark that you had done your pilgrimage, as it were. So there isn't a direct crusade link there in actuality, but we've sort of built a mythos around that. The Tyro, this is a particularly charged way of relating to Christ, because I think that there's a kind of false historiosity associated with it. The older something is, then the more serious it is within Christianity. And, kind of taking things back to the Greek, out of Aramaic, we see the Bible translated into kind of Greek first and then into Latin later on. And I think that is supposed to be showing us that there is a particular lineage to this form of thinking, whether or not there actually is. He's got guns, he's got swords and crosses. And I find this Matthew quotation really problematic because, all one really needs to do is just do some very basic scriptural analysis. The idea here, what he's kind of speaking about is actually, Roman order, such as it is at the time, and critiquing the sort of imperial violence that he lives within. But of course, you can lift that out of context. And this is a man who's excellent at doing that. And he's particularly primed to desire to find violent imagery within the Bible. And it's not easy to get Jesus on a bad day where he is actually advocating for violence. So he's got to kind of go for that one. But
he's also supplemented that with quotes from Pulp Fiction as well.
Yes, I was about to say. Yeah, so which is just, it is just emblematic of this entire thing as far as I'm concerned. These are people who claim to be these incredible Christians who really understand the Bible on a level that those of us who are not involved in it simply do not. And here he is quoting Samuel L. Jackson. Come on. What am I supposed to do with this? They're not great adversaries in terms of intellectualism, but unfortunately they hold rather a lot of power, so I'm stuck.
Hegseth, of course, has denied that the tattoos are evidence of far-right affiliations, and there does seem to be a certain degree of plausible deniability because some of the symbols, as you've described, do have contested meanings, not directly tied to the Crusades, for instance, in some cases. What do you make of that and this notion that he's put forward that he's engaged in some kind of relatively sort of uncontroversial affirmation of his Christian faith?
Yeah, I'm laughing because it's laughable, and it's an interesting one because if you know anything about Christianity, these aren't dog whistles, these are bullhorns. These are hand-picked, expressly violent quotations and references. And the only way that you can make an argument that they aren't is if the people you are arguing to don't know what it is. Right. And, if you don't know what Deus Vult means, you could say, oh, God wills it. It's about getting up and doing a great job every morning, being a good employee, but when we believe Crusaders to have yelled this, that's another thing entirely. And hey, listen, get a cross tattoo. There are, I'm sure, millions upon millions of people who have cross tattoos. And I don't even have a problem with people getting the Jerusalem cross as a tattoo, like when they visit the city. It's kind of a cool cultural thing that one can do. But in the context of someone who also has the tattoos of firearms and swords, one has to suspend one's disbelief to an incredible level, which I am unable to do. But again, this is why I've tried to strong arm you into having this conversation, because, you don't know what you don't know. Right.
Yeah,
If you're not aware of what all of these things mean, it is something that you can just sort of pass off as a garden variety fanatical Christianity, as opposed to an expressly violent one.
And I suppose another factor is that so many of the tattoos are directly related to the Holy Land, and that, seeing that coupled with images of guns and swords and so on and that sort of thing, the anti-Muslim character of this stuff is just right there on the surface.
Oh, absolutely. And that is laced throughout the administration in general. Not that I think that there's ever been a point in time when America has been particularly welcoming of the Islamic world, but there are some quite popular ahistoric ways of relating to, for example, the Crusades, where Americans like to view them or argue for them as part of an ongoing civilizational struggle between Christianity and Islam, which has always existed. They like to say that Islam has always been attempting to fight Christianity and vice versa. Whereas, all you have to do is study the Crusades to find that nothing could be further from the truth. I mean, really, the First Crusade, they get rather lucky. The Christians do, because basically the Seljuk Turks had just suddenly taken over, and there was a bit of chaos in the Middle East. They essentially managed to take everybody by surprise. And there had been some internecine fighting between varying Islamic factions that essentially the Christians were just another group who showed up and were attempting to take control of Jerusalem. And whether or not it was for religious or taxation reasons, it didn't mean particularly a lot to them. And all of the successive crusades were just kind of that again, playing out over and over. And all you have to do is read the documentation from the Islamic side. They don't care. So it's actually kind of embarrassing, because these Americans like to posit the civilizational historical struggle, but you can only do that if you actually read the sources. And if you read the sources, the Muslims are not particularly interested in seeing themselves as adversaries of Christians. And so it's very one-sided. We're saying, oh, Islam is the greatest adversary of Christianity, and Islamic people are sort of like, who? That is the trouble with history in general. And indeed, part of the reason why the Trump administration has been very expressly interested in curbing history teaching in America, shutting down particular historical groups, creating others that argue for ahistorical, conservative ways of looking at the world. Because, to be honest, looking into it doesn't give them the answer that they want.
Let's talk a bit about the relationship between the Christian right, the Trump administration, and Israel, and the way the relationship between Zionism and the Christian right has evolved over time. So the sort of conventional wisdom regarding Christian Zionist views of Israel was that Israel and its Jewish population were viewed by them in very instrumentalist terms. The idea being that the creation of Israel and the migration of Jews to the Holy Land would presage the end times of biblical prophecy and the second coming of Christ, and that the designated role of the Jewish population in that drama was that they would either convert to Christianity or be destroyed. But due, it seems, in part to the closeness and the sort of the increasing imbrication of the Christian right with the Jewish Zionist right, there has, it seems, been a shift in attitudes and that it's no longer the case, at least for some Christian Zionists, that Jews are marked down for this stark and brutal choice of convert or die. And perhaps this goes back to the point you were making about Pete Hegseth and his focus on Iran rather than the Levant, and maybe that is kind of indicative of this. Can you say something on the shift in attitudes in this area and how the relationship between Christian Zionists and Jewish ethno-nationalists has progressed and changed over time?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that we can't 100% discount the idea that a Jewish nation state is necessary for the apocalypse to come about as is stated in the Bible. That is certainly true. And I'm sure that there are probably Christian nationalists who still do believe that. And you can see, for example, people who are kind of anti-Zionist from the right. Sometimes these are things that will come up in these ideas. But increasingly, there seems to be a way of relating to it from the Christian nationalist perspective in America that Jewish people are sort of kind of temporarily embarrassed Christian, as it were. And instead of them necessarily being potential agents of Antichrist, they are people who are going to convert at the correct time. They are people who will eventually be confronted with Christ, and at that point in time, there will be some form of reckoning. Because, there is within Judaism an understanding that there is going to be some form of Messiah. That is true. It's just they disagree with Christians on whether or not Jesus was, which is also true of Islam. Islamic people think Jesus was a great guy. They just don't think he was the Messiah. It's one of these common Abrahamic things. So I do think that some of this is simply politically expedient. I think likely from the Israeli side, they don't particularly care, provided that they're getting, the weapons that they want and they're getting the material support. They're happy to play on people's prejudices. To be fair, why not? Why not take money off of somebody who is racist towards you? That's fine.
Yeah, I mean, people who are happy to ally themselves with European anti-Semites and fascists are obviously not too choosy about who's backing them.
Exactly. So there certainly is that. And I do think that as a part of that, one of the things that has just sort of been encouraged, I mean, certainly from the Israeli side, is this idea that, again, the real problem is Islam. All right, the real problem is Muslims, and Jewish people and Christians are united in their dislike of Muslim people, and in fact that Islam poses a direct threat to both religions. So to an extent, I think that there's a kind of better the devil idea of who to fight with when, and they're sort of saying, well, then we'll cross that bridge when we come to it, after the more direct threat of the existence of Islam is dealt with. But then having said that, clearly also Israel is very happy to align themselves, for example, with the Saudis. So I suppose there are Muslims and there are Muslims, and it all depends on who's paying the bills to an extent.
We're obviously talking at a time when support for Israel in US society in general is declining, and even amongst evangelicals, according to some recent polling. But presumably amongst those who are fervently pro-Israel and have shifted into this more sort of overtly philo-Semitic position, do you think that the intensity of their relationship with Israel and the fact that Israel's Jewish population is not seen in those more instrumentalist and anti-Semitic terms that they previously were, that this helps to make sense of the strength of the US relationship with Israel at a time when Israel's strategic value to the US seems a bit less clear than it once was?
Well, absolutely. I think that there is rather a lot of seeing Israel, to be fair, for what it is, as sort of American proxy. Certainly it's an American project if what we're talking about is just who is paying for it, right? There is rather a lot of interesting things coming out of America in terms of the philo-Semitism. So, Americans wearing Israeli flag earrings and all sorts of interesting things when they are not Jewish themselves. So, this is in particular, I would argue, not necessarily an expression of an interest in Judaism as a religion, but it is certainly a way of positing that there is kind of an American proxy there. To support Israel is to support the cause of right against Islam, which is necessarily wrong. And so if you are pro-Israel, then what you are is kind of like pro the West with a capital W. There's this idea that Israel is upholding Western values, such as they would like to think about them. And so as a result, you can just kind of make the next jump. These are not people who are like Muslims who are kind of characterized as other. And also, there are rather a lot of Americans in Israel. Very many Jewish people who decide to make Aliyah are originally from particular American groups. So there's a not insignificant diaspora. So you might know people, right, who are back there. So if you know some Jewish people in your life, then maybe they have family members there, then you can sort of be assuaged by that. Having said that, I think that the chances are if you're from, I don't know, Nebraska, that's probably not what your relationship to Israel is. But it is certainly true that there are lots of similarities between Judaism and Christianity. Christianity is just kind of cribbing all of Judaism's homework and running a few extra chapters at the back. It's not a huge rewriting of what is there. So for politically expedient purposes, I believe that it is possible for them to not think about this right now. If we posit that Jewish people need to be present at Armageddon, then you can understand how you can say, oh, if they're going to be present, well, maybe they're not so bad if it's also getting you what you want, which is some sort of all-out war on the concept of Islam itself.
Do you think it goes as far in some cases with American Christian Zionists of prioritizing Israel over the United States, in the sense that, people like Ted Cruz describe support for Israel as a religious duty? An article that you pointed me in the way of describes American pastors talking about Hurricane Katrina and various natural, economic and geopolitical disasters as being a consequence of US presidents, both Democrat and Republican, applying pressure on Israel to enter into peace negotiations.
Yeah.
And the author goes on to make the point that this seemingly not very patriotic behavior is rationalized to themselves, in the sense that the US is seen to be internally in a process of moral decline, whilst the opposite is the case in Israel, and that Israel is becoming a more morally pure society. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that is certainly at play. Many of these people very expressly are longing for a Christian state, and I think that they are slightly jealous of the ability of Israel to run a state that is expressly linked to their religion. We mentioned them in passing earlier. We see this, for example, with Catholic Integralists. There is this idea that we are in a new state of moral decline. This is not anything new. You tend to get ideas like this every 100 years or so. There will be a kind of idea about a necessary reform that comes up within Christian groups. And we certainly do see that on display here. So they're saying, oh, look at this idealized society, this society that is religious, that are just doing religious things. That would be great for us, right?
And I suppose also, if one is looking at Israel from the American vantage point, you see a society where every war that Israel undertakes, and even up to and including genocide, has tremendous public support in a way that is not true in the United States, right? There were not the levels of support for the Iran war in the United States that there was in Israel at the start of the conflict.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that one of the things that is quite interesting to Christian Zionists is, to a very real extent, the ethnic cleansing aspect of what we are seeing play out right now in Palestine. These are people who very expressly are involved in ethnic cleansing America right now. That is what ICE is doing. It's their raison d'etre, like they are there to try to get rid of undesirables who are speaking the wrong language or who are the wrong skin color. So it's not easy to explain to these people it is not a good thing to attempt to eradicate a group of people that you see as undesirables, because they're actually quite interested in doing that. And again, Hegseth very specifically and openly has said that in a book that he has published, arguing for this, right? These are people who are desirous of, at the very least, socially cleansing America. And, Hexa says that if you can't get rid of them physically, we should just be gerrymandered around and that sort of a thing. But you certainly see him also very expressly talk about America repeatedly as Judeo-Christian, which is very interesting because, I would like to see you run that one by the Founding Fathers. That's quite interesting. Again, there is just no historical precedent for that at all whatsoever. You can't say that at any point in time before the 20th century we really had Jewish people anywhere near the reins of power in America. And not that it's an expressly long history, but that is certainly true. And also by design. Christians weren't very keen on that. But this idea is posited in opposition to secularism, which is the problem. So, to say that Judaism is on the same side as Christianity is then to posit a side which is against people like me, who are the real problem. It's certainly not a problem for them if people wish to support Israel. What is a problem is people who wish to, send aid to other countries. That's the real existential threat.
So let's finally talk a little bit about the extraordinary spat between the Trump administration and the Vatican and Pope Leo. So back in January, Elbridge Colby, the Undersecretary of War for Policy, summoned the Holy See's then ambassador to the US, Cardinal Christophe Pierre, to the Pentagon to give him a dressing down because of the Pope's perceived criticism of Donald Trump's foreign policy and the so-called Don Roe doctrine. And this was really an unprecedented moment in US relations with the Vatican. And, there's no evidence of any Vatican official ever previously being summoned to the Pentagon. During that meeting, Colby, who himself is a Catholic, allegedly raised the matter of the Avignon papacy. This period in the 1300s when the French crown leveraged its tremendous military power to dominate the papal authority, and when the Pope's residence was in Avignon in the south of France. Can you talk a bit about the significance of the Avignon papacy and the kind of threat you think was being communicated to Pope Leo and the Vatican?
So obviously, I loved this. It's like the bat signal, but for me, because I'm quite interested in the Avignon papacy. It's my favorite.
Whereas I read about this and I'm just like, what?
What's that? So
what is this?
So you're bang on there in terms of what the actual Avignon papacy is. It's this period of 70 some years where the popes are in Avignon as opposed to Rome. What is often overlooked in this is that part of the reason they were in Avignon and not in Rome is that Rome was undergoing a succession of civil wars and was an incredibly dangerous place to be. Now, you can go ahead and question why the Pope should be so concerned with his safety if he is here to administer to the needs of the people. That's absolutely fine. But it isn't 100% just that the French crown is getting its way. The French crown, to be fair, was absolutely getting its way with the first two of the Avignon popes. But after that, it's a much more of a mixed bag. And I think it's also important to remember part of the reason why the papacy was in Avignon is they already held those lands. There isn't a one-to-one medieval to current states way of looking at things. So for us now, Avignon is very firmly in France. But at the time, it was its own place. These people spoke Occitan. They didn't even speak French. And it was sort of across the river from French holdings. Is that within the French sphere of influence? Absolutely. But they're also right next door to Arles, which was in the Holy Roman Empire at the time. So it's a little bit more complex than that in the way that it always is. And indeed, what I would argue here is this reference to the Avignon papacy is actually incorrect. And I think that what he's trying to reference is the Great Schism, the Great Western Schism. And the Great Western Schism is when we have 2 to 3 popes at any given time. And at that point in time, very, very expressly, the anti-popes who were in Avignon were working sort of hand in glove with the French kings. And you would see everyone in Europe kind of coming down on varying political lines for which pope they supported. It's almost only the French who were down for the Avignon papacy. And so I think that they were almost positing that we will start our own pope. And I find this absolutely fascinating because, well, in the first place, it is normal for the papacy to be at odds with powerful men. That's sort of what they do. The entire medieval period is full of nothing but jostling for power between popes and kings and emperors. That's what they're doing all of the time. And they often disagree on things. And as a general rule of thumb, one of the things that the church wants from leaders is for them to not be engaging in war. They only wish for war to be engaged in if it is seen as being for the purposes of the church. So, for example, Crusade. And fundamentally, what the papacy is arguing here is that this is not a crusade. And also a thing that the papacy is really well aware of that the Trump administration does not like to talk about is that rather a lot of Palestinians are actually Christian. And there are some very important Christian sites in Palestine, including Bethlehem, where Jesus was supposedly born. So to an extent, calling for constraint in Palestine, that's just kind of taking care of the flock. There are Catholics there, you know. And it is interesting to me to see people like Pence as well, kind of trying to vie with the papacy and argue with the papacy, because fundamentally, like it or not, but if you say that you're going to get another pope, you're a schismatic. You're not. you're not a Catholic. That's how it works. You can dislike that all you want, but that is the express idea of Catholicism. And I don't think that it's much of a surprise that we're seeing rather a lot of this come out of America, where they're sort of positing Catholicism as just another flavor of American Christianity, where it is very individualized. It is very connected with this concept of Americanism. And you can't really do that with Catholicism because there is a head of Catholicism. You know, there is a state. There's a papal state. As diminished as it is the norm for that state to be involved in politics. It is the norm of that state to attempt to constrain the worst excesses of leaders. And indeed, when you have Catholics in the administration, as in theory there are, you should be calling on them. You know, I don't exactly know why Pence hasn't been called to the Vatican, for example, you know, like and to get a dressing down, which is the sort of thing that I would expect a pope to do. Because it's normal. It's normal. That's what happens. So I'm not at all surprised that the papacy is at odds with America. What I am surprised by is that America thinks this is a fight worth having. There is usually not enough interest in what the church is doing to attempt to do this.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose, I mean, it seems like it kind of speaks to the way in which the Trump administration is all hard power and no soft power, right? Because, I mean, obviously there's the famous Stalin line, how many divisions has the Pope? Very sort of dismissive attitude, but Pope may not have many divisions, but he has a tremendous amount of soft power. But yeah, it does seem to be of a piece with the just general shredding of American soft power to pick a fight with the Catholic Church.
Yeah, it's quite interesting because I do think that this is one of these sort of late capitalist things that we are seeing in America, where, you know, there are those who have argued that once, you know, the Cold War was no longer on, America no longer saw the point in pursuing soft power in quite the same way and just kind of went all out for military power. And I'm not always predisposed to agreeing with that entirely, but I think in cases like this, it is quite interesting. And indeed, a lot of these people, they sort of long for John Paul II and this idea that what the papacy is for politically is to oppose communism. Right.
Yeah.
So they within living memory, there is this idea of a kind of more expressly right-wing pope that is doing the thing that America wants. It is involved in politics in what they see as being the correct way. And now that there isn't a need to be anti-communist, then, you know, the church can kind of get back to the, well, I don't know, I think maybe we should be feeding the poor sort of a thing. I do also think that it is quite interesting because we've got a term in America that people will call them cradle Catholics. So people who are sort of like born into Catholicism, who have more of an idea about the papacy as kind of, yeah, the generalized leaders of the church. Probably are supposed to be like somewhat nice to people, go to mass, these sorts of things. And this new wave of Catholic converts which we certainly know, for example, that Pence is a Catholic convert. And they seem to be very expressly interested, I think, in the history of the Catholic Church. And in particular, they're interested in the martial aspects of the Church in the medieval period, as we've been discussing. And so I think that they were kind of hoping to kind of come in and be able to yell Deus Vult and these sorts of things. But it's a really differing set of expectations, and it does attempt to elide the fact that, again, this is a hierarchical religion by nature. The Church is at its heart actually a legal organization. That's what the Vatican is, and so trying to then get in a legal argument with them about these things is ridiculous.
Just one final thought, and maybe you have some thoughts of your own on this, but just going back to Elbridge Colby and his invoking the Avignon papacy. One thing that I sort of thought about that, as you say, that may have been a mistake in terms of the historical example they were pointing to.
Of course, yeah.
And whether it's Colby or Hegseth, we see all the sorts of inaccuracies and historical ignorance of these people. But at the same time, the fact that someone like Colby can go to a meeting with people from the Vatican and bring up the Avignon papacy betrays a certain kind of literacy around these matters that I think is very foreign to the left, and as I mentioned before, the European left in particular. And I sort of hope that one thing that people will take away from this conversation is to go and do some reading, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think you'll find that it is a little more interesting than you think. It's not all doom and gloom. It can be really quite fun, actually, learning church history. And at the very least, it will help you laugh rather heartily at the things that are happening, even if it is with a sense of chagrin.
Sure. Yeah. Rather than just being entirely nonplussed.
Exactly.
You've been listening to Politics Theory Other. If you've been enjoying PTO and finding it useful, then please do consider becoming a £5 supporter on Patreon. The show depends entirely on listener support, and if you sign up, you can access bonus content, including listener questions episodes with PTO guests. Go to patreon.com/poletheoryother to sign up. The show's music and graphic design is produced by Planet B Productions. Thanks as ever for listening. I'll be back soon.